Welcome to Business Reporter's Best of British Business 2021 campaign. I'm Rachel Hicks. In 2018, the UK government introduced new legislation around the use of chemicals, placing tight restrictions on those that were considered to be causing harm to the environment and to humans. The government's Health and Safety Executive has since identified numerous what it calls substances of high concern that are in circulation in the UK, and the list of banned or restricted chemicals has grown accordingly. But what does this mean for companies and industries that for decades have been reliant on those chemicals? Bitrez, which started in 1982, has developed a range of alternatives that mimic the behaviour of banned substances, but that inflict minimal harm on the planet. These have become industry standards across aerospace, construction, food packaging and more. So much so that the company has won a gamut of awards in recognition of the vital role it's played in addressing and beginning to correct the environmental damage wrought by the industries of yesteryear. But how has it been able to do this? What does this new legislation mean for businesses? And how are industries now faring with Bitrez's products? That's what we'll be talking about with Paul Jones, Managing Director of Bitrez. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Rachel.
Now, the landscape for chemical manufacturing and use in the UK and the EU has changed quite significantly over recent years. Can you tell us a bit about those key changes and how and why they've come about?
Yeah, I think there's been quite a few changes, but there are two specific ones that I think I would raise. The first one being CLP, the Classification and Labelling and Packaging Regulations. Now, this is some EU legislation that emanates from a UN framework, GHS, which is a global harmonised system for the classification of chemicals. And this came about because the UN identified there was some discrepancies in the way chemicals or the chemical hazard was being classified in different areas or regions. And as a result, they came up with a standardized series of pictograms and a standard set of guidance, precautionary or hazard statements that could be employed in safety data sheets and on labels. And this also allowed the dissemination of the information through the supply chain in a consistent manner. The second piece of legislation is REACH, which is probably more of an impact on the EU. And REACH is an acronym for the registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals. And with the registration process, this was undertaken on a volumetric basis, and any manufacturer in the EU or any importer into the EU had to register these materials. And they then pooled all of the toxicological data that they had, and any gaps were undertaken as part of the evaluation process. This resulted in a series of lists with the authorization of the use of these materials, and in some cases the restriction and the restriction of the materials on a partial basis or with a view for the material to be taken off the market.
So in that case, what problems has the legislation caused for companies who have long used chemicals that are now restricted?
Well, I think first and foremost there's organisations who are supplying material and they have to advise their customer of a change in the classification, which is normally not in the direction they'd prefer. And then secondly, and probably more importantly, is the use of materials that contain substances of high concern that have been highlighted for phase out or removal from the market obviously leaves them with a problem and a dilemma to look for an alternative material that is going to be compliant and still perform to their required level.
So bearing all of that in mind, has there been any resistance to the legislation? And if there has been, what are companies afraid of?
Well, I think hesitance is probably how I'd describe the view from customers. And I think it's first and foremost because they feel that they could be adversely affected in terms of being in a position to compete with other regions that aren't necessarily going to face the same regulatory restrictions and costs, because obviously registering the material has a cost to it, and the development of a product that is compliant with the more stringent regulations that we observe in Europe is going to be more costly and problematic than those elsewhere.
Now, you offer a solution to these chemicals. Can you tell us what it is?
We develop products that are either falling below the threshold limit that causes some of the hazard ratings that these materials may have, or with an absence of the material. So we'll formulate out the problematic material and offer materials that allow continuity of supply and compliance with the regulatory requirements.
And how did you develop this range of solutions? What kind of research went into the design process?
Well, I think because we've had a long-standing relationship with organisations operating in the food packaging sector, we've had to, for a long period of time, we've had to comply with really quite stringent regulations anyway. So when REACH came along and there was a need to formulate products with these low residual monomer levels or the removal of specific materials, we had a history. So we have a team of experts who work on these things and have done for a long period of time, and this put us in a particularly good position to address some of the issues that were being made.
But you can understand that there might be some suspicion and concern about the cost and efficacy of a product that hasn't got a long history of being tried and tested. So how can you allay those concerns?
I think the best way of describing things is the fact that what we manufacture are polymers, and these polymers may be similar to some of the other products that are problematic, but when we develop products, we have some proprietary process techniques that allow us to make products without the residual monomers, which are invariably, they're the starting block for the products that we're manufacturing. And we developed products that are absent of these materials. So in terms of the technical performance and the processability of the materials, they're very, very similar. They've just got an absence of these hazardous items.
So the new legislation, we hope, is going to sort of go some way to correcting some of the damage caused by the toxic use of chemicals in the past.
Yeah.
What was your ultimate goal when you set about developing the alternatives that you now offer?
Well, I think first and foremost, we wanted to look after our customers and make sure that they had continuity of supply with materials that were safe, still offered the technical or surpassed the technical requirements that they may have. But further on than just looking at existing or current regulatory requirements, we look to the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN have cited, and we try to develop products that are not reliant on petrochemical feedstocks. So we look to materials that are grown and harvested, and as long as they don't have any adverse impact on the food chain or contribute to deforestation, then they're the kind of feedstocks that we're looking at now to move us towards a circular economy and try and, I suppose, fix some of the problems that are associated with the chemical industry. So we try to make products that are not only safer, but they're also greener.
Which has got to be a good thing.
I think so.
Paul Jones from Bitrez, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
You.